Thank you all. That was great. If you weren't here last week, we began a conversation about a Old Testament character, somebody maybe you've heard a lot about but don't know a lot about. And this guy's name is Elijah. And the very first way we're introduced to Elijah reminded me of what we experienced this week. So stick with me a second, you'll hear it. So in 1 Kings 17:1, here's how Elijah introduces himself. Elijah from Tishbe, that's all we know, by the way. He's from this real tiny, small town that we don't even know where it exists historically. Elijah from Tishbe, who's one of the settlers in Gilead, said to Ahab, who's king, "As surely as the Lord lives, Israel God, the one I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain these years unless I say so." Now that's pretty funny, right? Like that's a pretty audacious way to introduce yourself. Hey, king, my name's Elijah. I'm in charge of rain. And here's the better part. Now, it doesn't rain for over 3.5 years. Now think about that for a second. We just finally had rain, right? Some of you are happy that we finally had a break from that heat, the dryness. Some of you are worried about like your gardens, right? Some of you are worried about your grass, your flowers. Imagine if you didn't have rain for 3.5 years, how catastrophic that would be. Think about what that would do to not only your garden, but like the ability to get fresh produce at the grocery store. Think about what that would do to like all the farmers. Think about what that would be like to try to go just buy groceries, how expensive they would increase. Because, if you can't grow grain, that impacts livestock. Think about all the catastrophic events. Think about how it would be over 3.5 years, no rain. Think about what that would do to our rivers and therefore trade. Think about what that would do. Yeah, think about the idea of having to ration water. Have any of you ever experienced any time where you had to ration water? Some of you actually have. So the summer of 1995, I was in Kharkov, Ukraine. It's the second largest city in Ukraine, kind of near the Russian border, so we see a lot about it in the news. I spent 11 weeks there. In the middle of the summer while I was there, on June 29th, 1995, a flood came through and contaminated all their public water. And so any water that we wanted, for any reason whatsoever, we had to load up our backpack with empty 2-liter bottles of water, or 2-liter bottles of nothing, but soda bottles. We'd walk 2.5 miles to the spring, we'd fill them up, we'd walk 2.5 miles back, and then we'd have to walk up 8 flights of stairs to our apartment every time you wanted any water. So anytime you wanted a drink, you had to think like, I'm gonna have to carry this. Every time you wanted to brush your teeth, every time you wanted to wash your hands, you had to begin to think about like, how many showers do I really need? Or how many showers do other people think I really need? You begin to think about, we figured out that you could, now thankfully, God, there's one time where it's helpful to be bald, right? So we figured out we could take 2-liter bottles, we'd fill them up, and then we'd have this special screw tops that we created where we'd poke holes in it. That'd be our shower. So we'd try to figure out how little water could I shower with. And then we'd stand in the bathtub where we plugged it to shower off, and so that we collected the water. Then we would use that water to do the first rinse of our dishes, because anytime you wanted to cook, and you had to clean dishes. By the way, you'd have to think, how much water do I really need to make mac and cheese? Then we'd use that water. Now this is going to start grossing some of you out, but I'm telling the truth. We'd have to start washing our clothes in that water at some point too, right? Figure out like at least the first wash, maybe the rinse cycle, we got a little bit of fresh water in there. And then we'd collect the water. Whenever it was too dirty to do anything else, You know what we did with it? Use the toilet. That's right. That was what we used to refill the toilet water, because every time you flush the toilet, water. Now, you can think about this. What would it be like? And that's with modern technology. Now, think about it. 3,000 years beforehand, no water for 3.5 years. Could you even begin to fathom the frustration, the anxiety, the anger? You know, people are divisive sometimes. Take away water. Think about how divisive they would be. And then on top of that, we have one of the just meanest, evilest kings, King Ahab, who's just an awful, awful human being. And now he's in charge of the people of Israel, who are just angry. They're short-tempered. I'm guessing there's riots. He's king. He's trying to figure out, like, what are we doing? What's going on? And then he remembers 3.5 years earlier what happened. A guy knocked on the castle door, said, hey, I'm in charge of water. Peace out. How do you think he's feeling about Elijah right now? Now, this is where we're going to pick up the story. 1 Kings 18, verse 1. After many days, the Lord's word came to Elijah. It was the 3rd year of the drought. Go, appear before Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. So Elijah, by the way, Elijah went and appeared before Ahab. Think about this for a second. You're Elijah. God says, hey, I want you to go to the king who thinks you're in charge of water. Who's ready to go? Like, heck no. Choose somebody else. He knows who I am. We're good, God. Choose another guy. Choose another woman. Choose another. Like, send somebody else. Have you ever been invited to do something that you're really scared to do? Here's a better question. Has God ever asked you to do something that you're really scared to do? What do you do? What would it take for you to have a bold Elijah-like faith? What would it take in your life for God to tell you something that you are terrified to do, but God wanted you to do and you're willing to do it anyways, even though it's scary? What would that take for you? You know, as I read through stories in the Bible like Elijah, you can replace the name. You can, I could never, like Elijah could do it, but I could never do that. Do you ever think about that? Like, oh, Moses could do that, but I could never do that. Peter could do that, but I could never. Mary, she could do it, but who am I? You know the one thing that every one of those heroes in the Bible have in common? They're ordinary people just like you and me. In fact, many cases, they're far less educated, they have far less opportunities, they're far more ordinary than you all. You all are an exceptional group of people. I love getting to hear your stories, hear all the cool things that you're trained and you do. And the ordinary people in the Bible are far less extraordinary than us. You know the one thing they have that we don't sometimes? A willingness to say yes when God calls them. God chooses ordinary people like you and me to do extraordinary things. But it always begins, did you hear the first word? God said to Elijah, what? Go. It begins with that nudge of God. In fact, I think the first thing, what would it take for us to have a ridiculously Elijah-sized faith? It always begins with listening for God's nudging. It always begins with listening for God to call us to go. By the way, I don't get this right a lot of the times, but over the years, what I've learned in my own life, and some of you know this, is the more you begin to, wait, is that God or is that the Taco Bell I had too late last night? The more you begin to listen to God's nudging and then willing to go, the more you begin to recognize God's voice and the more courage you begin to have, right? It actually begins to snowball. And ridiculous acts of faith, ridiculous bold faith begins with our willingness to listen for God's voice and be willing to go when God calls us to go. What would it take for you to have that ridiculously big Elijah-like faith? Let's continue. We're going to skip ahead to verse 17. We're going to pick up the first part of this next weekend, and we're going to continue with what's after our story for today. But we're going to continue with 17. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, I wish I had like one of those voices that you hear in the movies where it's like the villain. I don't have that voice, so you have to imagine, is that you? The one who troubles Israel. I'm sorry to people listening online. That was really awful. I need a voiceover at that point. So, is that you, the one who troubles Israel? And by the way, that phrase I love, the one who troubles Israel, suggests somebody whose presence or action is destructive to the people. So what Ahab's saying is like, are you the guy who caused all of this? Now, which makes sense from Ahab's perspective, right? Because why? Elijah introduced himself, said, hey, I'm in charge of rain, leaves, and there's no more rain. So, it makes sense to to Ahab that Elijah's the troubler. But what if you're Elijah? Now, Elijah's like, wait, that wasn't me, right? That's a little, who does that? Wasn't me? Is that, Shaggy? No, not Shaggy, I got that right. Thank you. Some of y'all need to listen to music, by the way. It wasn't me. It wasn't, Elijah's like, it wasn't me. It was God. In fact, Elijah's role as a prophet is to draw the attention of the people back to God. And so Ahab was evil, and the people under Ahab's leadership started worshiping another god, a set of gods named Baal. We're going to hear about this in a second, but Baal is abusive, is destructive, is debaucherous, is just evil in so many ways that are contrary to the living God of Yahweh. And so Elijah, the reason they haven't had rain is because God's trying to get their attention saying, hey, people, you're messing up. Listen to the God, the living God, the God that wants what's best for you, instead of in this self-indulgent, destructive, evil sort of way that you're living right now. And so Elijah's like, hey, I'm not the troubler, so let's continue. I haven't troubled you. I haven't troubled Israel. You, Ahab, you and your father's house. Ahab's father was awful, just like he was. He was king. You and your father's house, you did as much when you deserted the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. Now send a message and gather all of Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel. Gather the 450 prophets of Baal, the 400 prophets of Asherah, who's another god that they worshiped back then, who eat at Jezebel's table. Jezebel is a queen. We're going to hear more about her next weekend. Even worse than her husband, or maybe their rival worse. I love making up words because people are like, eh. So Ahab sent a message to all of Israelites. He gathered the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah approached all the people and said, how long? How long will you hobble back and forth between two opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow God. If Baal is God, follow Baal. And the people gave no answer. Elijah said to the people, I'm the last, which is funny. That phrase is going to come back up next week as we continue the story. But I'm the last of the Lord's prophets. But Baal's prophets number 450. I love this. Can you kind of hear it? Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. The battle between Baal's 450 versus Elijah. Sorry, you're hearing it. Give us two bulls. Let Baal's prophets choose one. Give them home court advantage. Let them cut apart the bull and set it on the wood, but don't add fire. Now just me. You got 450, but me, I'll do my own thing. I'll prepare the other bull, put it on the wood, but won't add fire. Then all of you can call in the name of your God, and I will call in the name of the Lord, the God who answers with fire. That's the real God. Now, what all the people say? That sounds awesome. Like they're getting a front row seat to an epic showdown that's going to be recorded in history for 3,000 years. That's got to be pretty cool, right? So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of these bulls, prepare it for first, since there's so many of you. Call in the name of your God, but don't add fire. So they took one of the bulls, they had it brought to them. They prepared it and called on Baal's name from morning to midday. They said, great Baal, answer us. There was no sound or answer. They performed a hopping dance around the altar. By the way, last night I performed a hopping dance. It was awkward for people there and here, but more importantly, I know we're worshiping online, so there's no way I'm going to leave that as proof on the internet for somebody to make the meme. You all are just missing out. Just pointing that out. They performed, but you can imagine, a hopping dance. I love that, around the altar that had been set up. And then my favorite verse. Around noon, Elijah started making fun of them. Shout louder! Certainly he's a god, or perhaps he's lost in thought. Maybe he's wandering or traveling. Maybe he's on vacation. Or maybe he's asleep. Maybe you should wake him up. Now, this is why I love Elijah, by the way, because he has this ridiculously a bold faith. I love him that he trash talks, by the way. If you've ever been to a sporting event with me or will, you may be embarrassed by sitting next to me. My wife certainly is sometimes. She's like, you go sit over there. Because I joke my spiritual gift is trash talk. But there's something here that I think, I don't want to skip over, and I skipped over it, so I'm going to go back. Elijah what he was doing was he was drawing the attention of the Israelites back to God. God was using him to call people back. And another way to say that is he was inviting them to do what was right, even though everybody else in the world was doing what's wrong. Now, we know what that's like, right? You tell your kids or your grandkids, or maybe your parents told you that, right? Like, just because everybody else jumps off a bridge, would you? Depends on how much fun it looks like, right? But no, like, we teach this lesson, just because everybody else is doing what's wrong doesn't mean you have to. And what he's doing is he's talking to a culture where everybody else was in this just kind of wicked, evil version of religion that is so contrary to the way that God wants us to live and creates us to live. And he's trying to draw their attention to that. And sometimes that means, for us, it means doing what's right, even whenever the world around us seems to be consumed with all the things that are wrong. But I also know that whenever I put up slides, or preachers put up slides like that, do what's right when everyone else is doing what's wrong, it's just vague enough that you can use that to justify whatever dumb thing you want to say, like people use that to just say sexist or racist or homophobic or just evil, mean, jerky things. They say it, they post it, and so I don't want to be confused. So I rewrote this slide. Let's put up the better version of the slide. Be bold, but don't be a jerk. Don't be obnoxious. Now that's really important, because if we're talking about Elijah, he maybe doesn't get this one quite right? He's like, oh, maybe your God's sleeping. Like, come on, chill out, Elijah, a little bit. But I do think that sometimes we need to have this bold, ridiculously bold faith without being a jerk. We can still be kind and loving. So let's continue on. So the prophets of Baal cried with a louder voice, and they cut themselves with swords and knives, as was their custom, and the blood flowed all over them. Kind of gruesome, right? Let's move on. As noon passed, they went crazy. They went crazy? Sounds like they were already crazy. It went crazy with their ritual until it was time for the evening offering. Still, there was no answer, no sound or answer, no response whatsoever. Then Elijah said, y'all done? All right, my turn. Come here, come here. All the people closed in. He repaired the Lord's altar that had been damaged. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the son of Jacob, to whom the Lord's word came. Your name will be Israel. He built the stones into an altar in the Lord's name. He dug a trench around the altar big enough to hold 2 seahs of dry grain, which is a ridiculously large amount of grain. You're going to hear what that looks like. He put the wood in order, butchered the bull, placed the bull on the wood. Now he said this, fill 4 jars with water and pour it over the sacrifice and the wood, because dry wood isn't like a hard enough challenge. Let's make it wet wood. He commanded, doing it a second time. So they did it a second time. Do it a third time. So they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, even the trench filled with water. Are you following the image? Let me just point out something absurd, ridiculously absurd. What's the one thing they haven't had for 3.5 years? Water. He's like, hey, gather all this water that you don't have. Right? Remember how precious water is? Remember rationing water? Remember how important water is? Gather all this excess water that's probably the most precious commodity you have right now. Talking about a ridiculous God-sized faith. At the time of the evening offering, the prophet Elijah drew near and prayed, Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God in Israel and that I am your servant. I've done all these things at your instructions. By the way, he listened to God's nudging. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so that these people will know that you, Lord, are the real God and you can change their hearts. Then the Lord's fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up the water of the trench. I love that detail. Can you hear just the ridiculousness of this story? I want to ask you a question. This reminds me of, have you ever prayed a big, bold, Elijah-sized prayer like this? Can you imagine his prayer? He lays it all out. He goes in abundance and excessive, like the miracle, the taunting, the laying out this bowl, the water, all of this to just allow God to do this ridiculous miracle. Here's my question. Are you willing to pray big prayers? Because I think a ridiculous faith begins with big, God-sized prayers. Now, I have a confession. I'm a United Methodist pastor. I've been with people so many times during incredibly painful, hurtful, scary situations. I haven't been with a lot of you yet, but I will over the next many years. And in those moments, I'm always a little internally anxious about what to pray for. I remember a few years ago, one of my friends at a previous church, a youngerish, the older I get, people seem younger. The youngerish friend of mine who was in the hospital with COVID. And I remember praying big, bold prayers, only to see him die. And that's a scary thing because I want to pray big, bold prayers, but in my experience, so often they don't get answered like I think they should. And the alternative is to pray safe, predictable, convenient prayers, which unfortunately get answered too often exactly like I want them to. And even with that struggle, I realize that, but I want to be the type of pastor, I want to be the type of Jesus follower, I want to have the type of faith that is still willing to pray big, bold prayers, even when I'm not sure what's going to happen. What about you? How do you pray? Do you pray predictable, safe prayers? Or are you willing to trust and step out and see God do something ridiculous that you are utterly incapable of doing or imagining, and yet God might still want to do anyways? I don't know what that looks like for you. I know I struggle with that. One of the things this story reminds me of is ridiculous faith has big prayers. Let's continue. The last part of the story. I love this. Elijah said to them, seize Baal's prophets. I don't love this first part. I love the second part. Don't let any escape. The people seized the prophets, and Elijah brought them to Kishon Brook and killed them there. And Elijah then said to Ahab, get up, celebrate with food and drink, because I hear the sound of the rainstorm coming. So Ahab got up to celebrate with food and drink, but Elijah, he went to the top of Mount Carmel, where this thing happened. He bowed down to the ground, put his face between his knees. He must do yoga. That sounds uncomfortable. And he said to his assistant, please get up and look towards the sea. So the assistant did so. He says, I don't see anything. 7 times Elijah said, do it again. Do it again. And the 7th time the assistant said, all right, Elijah, I don't know if this is what you're asking. Maybe I see like this little small, itsy bitsy cloud the size of a human hand out on the horizon. Maybe I see it there. And Elijah said, go and tell Ahab, pull yourself together, go down to the mountain, and don't let the rain hold you back. The what? Remember, how long? 3.5 years. After a little while, the sky became dark with clouds. A wind came up from a huge rainstorm. This is why I thought of this scripture last night, right? A huge rainstorm. Ahab was already riding his way to Jezreel, but the Lord's power strengthened Elijah. He gathered up his clothes, and he ran in front of Ahab until he came to Jezreel. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Now, we're going to continue the story next week, but I just want to pause with one more lesson about ridiculous faith. And that's simply, ridiculous faith relentlessly looks for hope. Now, friends, we live in a world where it's easy to critique. It's easy to complain. It's easy to criticize. If you came here this morning wanting to find problems, mistakes, you're going to find plenty of them because I'm up on stage. You know, the easy thing is to be negative, pessimistic, critical, cynical. I live in a world where that's easy. Whether you're looking at church, at home, at work, in relationships, the young kids these days, whatever, old people, whatever you want to do. It's easy to critique. You know what's hard? It's hard to see a tiny human hand-sized cloud on the horizon. It's hard to see hope. It's hard to see the potential, the possibility of God doing something like rain when it hasn't rained in 3.5 years. It's hard to see that God could do something that is ridiculously unimaginable. It's hard to see that God is doing something beautiful and good and holy in a world full of brokenness, hurt, and pain. It's hard, and yet this is who God calls us to be, a people of hope. I love Elijah's story because in the middle of all the things wrong with Ahab and with Baal and with the way the things were going and all the problems, and we're going to see more about his own problems next week, but in the midst of all of that, he relentlessly chooses to see hope, and that's what faith is. Faith is seeing a God of possibilities even when everybody else is telling you you're wrong. And I love Elijah's ridiculous faith because he's willing to pray big prayers, to see hope, and to listen to God's voice and relentlessly chase it, even when it's scary and uncomfortable and he doesn't know what's going to happen. Are you willing to have that type of faith? Or maybe I should say, what would it take to have that type of faith?